So welcome everyone. My name's Ed Horn, supposedly retired but not really, pastor in the New York Annual Conference and the convener of the New York chapter MFSA leadership team. We've been working on the issue of anti-racism now, specifically for a couple of years, doing workshops on preaching about white privilege and legislation to annual conference, working on in support of our coalitions of color and conscience around the annual conference. And as we were gathering during this time of pandemic, we've been seeking to expand our reach to a broader participation in the annual conference. And then, of course, now just about a month ago, we had the terrible situation in Minneapolis with George Floyd and all that's resulted from that, and the heightened awareness around white supremacy and the call to work on anti-racism. And so discussing our program opportunities, we remembered that we have a connection through Ann Craig specifically to Reverend Fred Davie, who is the Executive Vice President of Union Theological Seminary and the chairperson of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. And so we reached out to Fred to bring us a presentation about policing and how it relates to race and racial injustice, and as a window into talking about economic issues and many others. And so we came up with this forum tonight, Whose Streets, on policing and injustice. And in a minute, I'm going to ask George McLean to introduce Reverend Davie more formally to us. But we certainly want to recognize and welcome our Bishop, Bishop Thomas Bickerton. So great to have you, Bishop. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. I know you have.
Thanks, Ed. Good evening, everybody. Nice to be with you.
We appreciate the Bishop's really strong commitment now on this issue and leadership both in our annual conference and nationally. And so we look forward to a lot of dynamic work in the years to come, months and years to come. And I know there are a couple of members of the New York Cabinet who are also here or will be, so welcome to you all as well. And welcome especially to all of our lay and clergy from around the New York Annual Conference. It's great to see, as George was saying, great to see some familiar faces, and it's great to see some new faces. So we'll, at the end, kind of mention an opportunity if you'd like to become a member of our chapter. It's a great organization with a wonderful history, over 100 years of doing justice work in the United Methodist Church and in the country as a whole. But for now, let's begin. If I might offer a word of prayer. So let's be in prayer together. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for all the things in our lives, even technology that we don't expect to jump in and do things. We give you thanks for this opportunity to gather through technology that is giving us the chance to be together even when we must be separated. It is, God, an unprecedented, strange, and challenging time in our lives. So God, we pray that you will guide us through this moment when it seems to be that we have come to a place where we actually might address in a more fundamental way some centuries old injustices and harm and hurt that has been done to so many people in our midst. We pray, God, that you will make this more than a moment, but that it will become a movement for real substantive change, beginning with our own lives and extending out to the life of our entire nation and beyond. Be with us this evening. Be with our speaker as he shares from his head and his heart, and be with each of us that we might be touched and moved to join this tidal wave of change that is sweeping across our country. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. And George McLean will introduce Fred.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for that earnest prayer. To Ed and thank you for that earnest prayer. I want to echo Ed's welcome to all of you, MFSA friends, old and new, to this special event. And it is my great delight to introduce our presenter, the Reverend Fred Davie. I'm sure we'd all agree that there's no more pertinent or urgent topic right now than that of police accountability. And to my mind, there is no person with a better view of the challenges and opportunities to fashion and strengthen police accountability than Fred. He has just been reappointed chair, I think, for another 3-year term of the New York City's Civilian Complaint Review Board, with oversight of the nation's largest police force. CCRB, as it is known, investigates every citizen complaint it receives regarding alleged police misconduct and makes recommendations regarding follow-through and possible consequences. Reverend Davie is an ordained Presbyterian minister. He's held many important positions, a few of them, among them, program officer at the Ford Foundation, deputy Manhattan Borough president, and member of President Obama's transition team back in those good old days, if you recall. He has received a Distinguished Alumnus Award from his alma mater, Yale Divinity School. And perhaps most important among his many responsibilities right now, Fred's day job is, as Ed said, as Executive Vice President of Union Theological Seminary, an institution which many of us hold particularly dear. Fred, we look forward to hearing from you in a moment. I turn the screen over now to Reverend Jennifer Berry, who will guide our discussion.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you. Just so that we all know how we're going to go about our evening, Reverend Davie will speak, and as you come up with questions, you can just put them into the chat. We have people on the leadership team who will be compiling those into sort of topics and areas so that we're a little more focused in our discussion after Reverend Davie speaks, and then we'll be able to get those questions asked, and I'll kind of keep us on some sort of track for time, and we'll have a great evening. And then I'll close us out or give us back to Ed. Sound like a good plan? Great. Reverend Davie, we can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. But a particular word of thanks to Ann Craig for extending the invitation for me to join you tonight. I think I met you now over 40 years ago, both students at Yale Divinity School. So, and found ourselves in New York and traveling similar paths. So it's feels a little bit like full circle these days. I also met Serene Jones at Yale Divinity School, and she invited me now 9 years ago to come join her at Union. That also feels like having come full circle. George, thank you for that introduction. It's always good to see you, and I appreciate your guidance to me when I tried to finish an a DMin, excuse me, at Theological Seminary, but never completed it. But you were patient and kind, and I was actually got waylaid with other things, but thank you for that introduction. Bishop Bickerton, is good to see you, and I'm also glad you could join us tonight, and the full cabinet and others who joined us from around, I guess, the New York metropolitan area it would be. There are a lot of ways to come at this issue of policing and community, and particularly communities of color. I want to come at it from what I know best right now, and that is police oversight, civilian oversight of police. Talk a little bit about the CCRB, the work we do, the resources we still need. And the CCRB is just one tool in this effort to improve police-community relations. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the city council did and what the state legislature did, the state legislature first and then the city council, to help provide tools to have better oversight, more transparency, and more accountability in policing. say a word or two about some demographics, and then stop and open it up for conversation. So let me just say, I grew up in a little town called Belmont, North Carolina. I was just at the cusp of the civil rights movement, or at the outer edge of it, or the later edge of it, and when I was around 9 years old. And the year before our little town, which was segregated, sort of fully integrated, a group of us were playing in the streets one summer day, and decided that it was time to go integrate the local amusement park that in those days, which was in 1965, had Tuesdays reserved for coloreds. So I don't know what day of the week it was, but it wasn't Tuesday. And I know it wasn't Sunday because the park wasn't open on Sunday. A group of us went to the park to integrate it, and we were all kids. Our parents had no idea we were going. It was about a mile away, and we just walked there. And I can remember being ushered out of that park by big, burly police officers. And my first sort of real encounter with law enforcement as a tool for enforcing racial and social order. Probably a few months after that, a group of us were playing in a field in my little hometown, and one of the off-duty police officers, white, decided he was going to have a little bit of fun with us. So he stood on a hill over the field where we were playing and pulled out his gun and started shooting over our heads. But we didn't know that, telling us to run, you little black jackrabbit niggers, run. And run we did, screaming and crying, not quite sure what was happening and what was going on. My second encounter with law enforcement as a tool of social control. But I couple that with the fact that I had an uncle I was very close to who was a high-ranking member of the Charlotte Police Department around that same time or shortly after, and another cousin that I was really close to who was a member of the NYPD here in New York. So I bring those experiences to the current day and to this job, trying to not sugarcoat or at all, not at all shun or be in denial about the continued brutality that exists in policing in New York, but also not totally dismissing the whole notion of law enforcement as a necessary component of what it means to be in community, not only here in New York City, but around the world. In 2016, late 2016, Mayor de Blasio, whom I'd known for a while since being in New York, he and I had worked for Mayor Dinkins back in the early 90s. And I actually performed his wedding. Don't hold it against me, whatever you think of him, but I officiated his wedding in 1994. He and Shirlene asked me to do that after we left City Hall, and I did. He reached out through his staff and asked if I would join the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I paid a lot of attention to it. I'd known, I was at City Hall when the board in its current form was made a completely independent board, took it out of the police department and made it a completely civil, Mayor Dinkins made it a completely civilian board. So since 1993, I'd been watching and paying attention to the Civilian Complaint Review Board, noticing how it was being underfunded in the Giuliani administration, not being taken very seriously by Mayor Giuliani. And then how it was sort of given a little more life in the Bloomberg administration, but still struggled until I think Christine Quinn decided she was going to run for mayor. Saw it as an important force in balancing the dynamics between the community and the police department. And so she helped, along with some officials in the Bloomberg administration, to actually make it a stronger organization. So let me say a word about the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Most people don't know it. and don't know what it is and don't know what it does. Let me tell you this, had it not been for the Civilian Complaint Review Board, Officer Daniel Pantaleo would be walking free today. And in the process of telling you about the board, I'm gonna tell you why. Daniel Pantaleo, as many of you know, is the officer who strangled Eric Garner and caused his death. So the CCRB in its current form was founded in 1993 by Mayor Dinkins. It currently is a 15-member board, just became a 15-member board, with City Council appointing 5 members, the mayor appointing 5, the public advocate appointing 1, and the mayor and the City Council and the city speaker of the City Council now appointing the chair, and that's new. In the past, the mayor appointed the chair alone, but that changed last November. There are about 200 employees. About half of those employees are investigators, and they investigate all the complaints that come in against New York City police officers that are made by the public. The agency has jurisdiction in 4 fairly broad areas: excessive force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language. We call that FADO, F-A-D-O, force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language. And within those broad categories of complaints or allegations that can be made, there are other charges that happen within those categories. So for example, recently the CCRB made a decision that it was going to start investigating sexual misconduct by police officers, which it had not previously done under the abuse of authority. The people of the city of New York last November in a ballot initiative provided by the Charter Revision Commission voted to give the agency a power to investigate officers who are untruthful in the course of not only doing business with the agency, but in the course of doing business while they're under oath. So it had, and the agency has subpoena power. So we can compel testimony, we can gather evidence, and we can compel police officers to testify. They don't have an option of not testifying. And then the agency, after receiving complaints and investigating them, decides on a level of penalty for the officers whose cases have come before us and we're reviewing. And we can do several things. We can substantiate a case, that means to find the officer guilty. We can unsubstantiate a case, and that means we say by a preponderance of the evidence, we cannot determine whether something happened or not. We can say a case is unfounded. That means we can say the activity did happen, that the activity did not happen. A preponderance of the evidence says it didn't happen. Or we can exonerate the case, and that is the activity did happen, but it was not illegal. And then on the basis of that, particularly when we find that an officer is guilty, substantiate a charge, then we make a recommendation to the police commissioner. And this is where the problem comes and why I think people don't necessarily have the confidence in the agency that it could, because the police commissioner has final authority on what kind of discipline an officer will actually receive. What the agency has worked very hard at is trying to get there to be concurrence between the discipline we recommend and the discipline the commissioner actually imposes. And right now, I think we're at about, on the less serious cases, probably about 70% of the time, what we recommend he adheres to. And on the more serious cases, we're probably less than 50%. One of the things that the agency is really advocating for is some form of binding disciplinary recommendations. So if the agency makes a recommendation, the commissioner has to adhere to it within certain parameters. Right now, the commissioner can either accept, modify, or reject recommendations that are made. Just to get into the weeds a little bit more, and I won't bore you with this, but I think it's important for people in New York particularly to know what kind of authority this agency has. There's another piece of authority that we have only by agreement between the agency, the City Hall, and the department. And that's the ability to actually take cases and prosecute them at a departmental trial. And that's what we did with Officer Pantaleo, who strangled, as you know, Eric Garner. When the Staten Island DA took a pass on bringing an indictment, when after 5 years, the US Justice Department took a pass and didn't bring any charges against him. The CCRB was the last place where the Garner family might get some justice for the death of Eric Garner. And that was because this agency has the right to bring charges against an officer. It's called charges and specifications. It's the most serious charge that the agency can bring. And then take that case to a departmental trial and prosecute it before a departmental trial judge. And even though the mayor gave us no credit and the police commissioner gave the agency no credit, CCRB took that case before a departmental trial judge, the last stop before Officer Pantaleo would go free. Our lawyers argued that case before a trial judge. We called for Officer Pantaleo's termination as being the final sentence. The trial judge agreed with CCRB at the end of the trial, recommended to the commissioner the agency's recommendation that Officer Pantaleo be fired. And after a lot of churning, as some of you will recall, the police commissioner then did fire Officer Pantaleo. It's unfortunate that it was never cited by the mayor that this agency was responsible for that, and never cited by the police commissioner that the agency was responsible for that. And so it leaves New Yorkers not knowing that they have this tool, they have this instrument that helps to balance the power differential between police officers who have considerable authority and the people of New York City that they are sworn to serve. We are working hard to get that this authority that we have now by memo to prosecute officers in a departmental trial for the most serious cases codified into law. It's one of those pieces that we're missing in terms of being able to do our job. Now, let me say a little bit about the people who bring complaints, and this gets at what we're at today. In probably about 75% of the cases that come before the CCRB, they're usually men of color, and the officers against whom a complaint is lodged are usually white officers. That black-white dynamic is very, very, very serious and still very real within how police officers, law enforcement relates to communities of color. The department has tried things like implicit bias training, requiring it of all its officers. But I think that the department really needs to take seriously racial profiling, admit that it exists, and seriously investigate it. And if it doesn't, the CCRB will. So in 2017, the department received about 700 complaints of racial profiling and did not substantiate a single one of them. So CCRB is moving to assume authority for being able to investigate racial profiling. I think the department also needs to recognize the fact and acknowledge the fact that there's still systemic racism within its structures. In fact, most organizations that got a start by majority white originators, continue to deal with systemic racism, and the police department is no different. But the only way to root it out is for the department to acknowledge it, and that remains a fairly difficult and contentious task. The city council and the state legislature recognize that more tools are needed when it comes to dealing with the NYPD. And so some of you know that a couple of weeks ago, we got sweeping legislation in light of what happened to George Floyd, the real tragedy of George Floyd out in Minneapolis. The legislature acted swiftly, and the governor signed these bills. And let me just go through them quickly because they're important. One of the most important ones is that it criminalizes chokeholds. It simply says that chokeholds and other kinds of restraints that cut off the breathing of people who are under police control are simply illegal and should not happen. It also requires officers to display their badges. We get many complaints at the CCRB because the police officers, and you heard it in the protests, were simply covering their badges and not allowing people to view the badges. Now that's a violation of police procedure, and the CCRB has been investigating cases and recommending discipline for officers who do hide their badges, but now it's against the law. It's not only a procedural infraction, but it's criminal. The state legislature is requiring a disciplinary mix. Actually, the city council is requiring that as well. That there be some consistency in the types of punishments that these officers get. 50A repeal. So 50A is a law, many of you know, that kept police records secret when the Garner family was looking to find out about what happened to Officer Pantaleo as a result of the trial. It would have been illegal for CCRB to tell them had not most of it leaked out in the press because of the 50A law. Well, that has been repealed. There's a special prosecutor now in the AG's office to investigate officer-involved civilian deaths when it involves a police officer in New York State. There's a law that allows people to monitor police behavior by recording it. And unless the person is interfering with police activity, the police have no right to interfere with that monitoring. That was a part of the patrol guide for policemen and women, but now it is law. Medical attention for people who are under arrest. You saw what happened with George Floyd, Eric Garner here in New York. Officers often, once they've restrained someone, when they're under duress or in distress, they do nothing. They watch and stand by and look. Well, that's now not only a violation of procedure, but it's illegal. And then the state legislature, among other things it's done, has said if you file a 911 complaint and you do it on the terms of, and you file it falsely based on a person's race or gender or gender identity, sex, etc., then you are guilty of a hate crime. All these are tools that are really important in terms of having oversight of a police department that has 36,000 officers on the street, that has a $6 billion budget, and that has surveillance tools that it can use for a variety of different things, and then has the backing, more times than not, of elected officials who really fear, one, I think some cases too much, the police unions, and two, that crime will spike and they will be held responsible for it. So these are all important tools. And then the city council passed a slew of other bills. I was actually reading some of those to you when I should have actually been talking about the state legislation. I won't go through those. We can talk about some of that in our discussion. Let me say a word about the whole defunding police movement. So I think we need police departments. So I'm not in favor of completely dismantling departments and getting rid of their budgets. What I am in favor of is transferring responsibilities out of the department that they should not have, that civilians can actually do, and with the proper training probably do better. For example, intervening in cases where there are mental health issues as opposed to making something a criminal matter or a law enforcement matter. There should be more opportunities for people who are experts in mental health to actually intervene in these issues. I'm in favor of looking at the $6 billion budget, in this case of the New York City Police Department, and saying, how can we transfer some of those resources, as others have said, and use them for youth services, social services, to strengthen the CCRB and civilian oversight of the department. There are some changes that we should pay attention to that are happening within the department. One of the things that I'm also in favor of, particularly as the department starts to change, is changing the culture within the department itself, to move away from this enforcement and domination, as if that's the only way to keep peace in the streets, and look more at engaging community folks, community organizations, community leaders to ensure crime reduction. And that can happen. Everyone said after we got rid of stop and frisk in New York, we were going to have this big explosion of crime. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened. And a big piece of the reason it hasn't happened is because community organizations, faith-based organizations, and community leaders in these communities have taken responsibility for engaging young people and others who are in those crime-prone ages, if you will, and offering them constructive alternatives. Queensbridge Housing, which is not far from where I live in Long Island City, went for about an 18-month period without a shooting or a killing at all. And that's because they established their own community patrols. Now, unfortunately, civilian patrols, the local precinct, I'm told, did not cooperate as well as they could have. But these people took it upon themselves to try to bring some peace to their neighborhood. And they did, and to that housing project, and they did. You don't hear a lot about that because for some reason there's still this hesitancy to talk about how we might do policing differently. But I'm all in favor of it, and there are models out there that we should pay attention to. And perhaps with these changes that are afoot, for example, the demographics of the police department are changing. We now have a minority of officers who are on patrol, who are patrol officers. They are the youngest people. People from captain and up are still majority white males, but that's got to change because you have a force that's changing. We have more of the people who are on patrol, the officers who are on patrol, who actually live within the boroughs of New York City. They are now neighbors of the people that they have sworn to serve. And so what we need to do is do more to cultivate those types of relationships. But so that people continue not to see the people they're serving as enemies or animals, or as one high-ranking New York City official is quoted as saying, calling them savages, but to see them as neighbors and brothers and sisters and friends, siblings that they are serving, as opposed to dominating and controlling. I'll say one final thing, and then I'll stop, and we can open it up. And that is that the protests have resulted in the CCRB, rightfully so, being inundated with complaints against officers. We're probably up at 800. over about 200 different incidents. We have investigators who are now interviewing complainants. We will start interviewing officers right after the 4th of July. And not only are we going to investigate the violations of FATO, force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language, but we too are going to look for patterns and practices that aren't conducive to good community relations and police community relations, and make recommendations to the department about changes that need to be made. The State Attorney General is doing the same thing, and the Department of Investigations also in the city also has an investigation going on. I think these protests have created an opportunity. The death of George Floyd hopefully will not be in vain, as tragic and as awful as it was, or Eric Garner, or the scores, if not hundreds, of other people who had died unjustly and without justification at the hands of law enforcement. That those deaths won't be in vain. As this thing begins to open up, and we see new legislation, new approaches to law enforcement, a strengthened civilian oversight, and the ability to improve police community relations, but particularly to improve and make better the relationship between communities of color, particularly African Americans, African American men, and the departments, the law enforcement officers, members of service who are sworn to serve them. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much. So as a reminder, if you have questions, if you could just type those into the chat, and then we'll get them neatly sorted and asked away. But I'll go ahead and get us started. If only I could figure out which question to ask first. Since this is a faith-based group, why don't we start with this question? How can pastors and faith leaders initiate relationships with police and the communities they patrol?
Right. So I think in New York City, and I can't speak for, but I think it's probably similar for those places outside of the city, there are precinct councils in most neighborhoods, and I do think it's really important for faith leaders to be involved in those precinct councils, and not be co-opted, and not that officers or the department would necessarily co-opt you, but you want to be wary of it, and become a part of those councils and be the voice of not only your parishioners, but the communities where the parishes and churches lie. I would say engage more around the CCRB. If you're in New York City, encourage people to make complaints and then help them stay with the process. One of the biggest problems we have is the agency CCRB has, is about half of the people who make complaints don't follow through. And we end up what we call truncating those cases, and basically we have to close them because the complainant or the victim, when the two are different, disappears. So what we're endeavoring to do, and we're pushing the city to help us do, is to develop a complainant witness support unit, so that when usually people come in to make a complaint, they have all kinds of other attending problems. You know, they're homeless, they're unemployed, they've got problems with members of their own family. They need to work and don't have the time to engage us in the ways that we like them to. But I think clergy and other community leaders could support people when they make the complaints, help them deal with some of the issues that might keep them from following through. And within the CCRB, we're working hard to make sure that we support people who come in and make complaints as well. So engage the local precincts, engage the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and if the mayor, the city council member in your area, state legislator, or even congressperson provides an opportunity to engage around policing and law enforcement, by all means take advantage of it, and be present in those opportunities.
Thank you. Sort of, I guess, a next level of that, how can pastors and people of faith engage, would be how have you understood your specific role as clergy and a person of faith within the CCRB?
Right. So I'm beginning as I'm getting ready to end my career, I'm beginning to look at all of these things as a form of call that I just never expected to be a part of my life, and just come out of the blue. I never expected to be a member of the CCRB. I never expected to be chair. It's not anything that was ever in my preparation, thinking about my future. But then there it was. First, to be on the board, and then for the board to need a chair, and then to be tapped by the mayor, and then by the mayor and the speaker to be that chair. I see it as a sense of call. I wasn't looking for it. It came out of the blue. I'll give you another example. Most recently, some of you saw that Senator Schumer just recently appointed me to be on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. That was a very short process. And I only bring it up because it's another example of maybe, I don't know, is it God? Is it providence? Is it just coincidence? I have no way of knowing. But what I do know is that it has the feel of a sense of call. That this, for this time, and I don't have to be perfect. I think God knows lots of people will tell you I'm not. But it just has this deep resonance that this is what I should be doing at this time. Not forever, but at this time. And so I connect theologically by seeing it as a call for a period of time at this point in history, and depending on the grace of God to do what I can, where I can, recognizing that I'm going to make some missteps, and some of them will be doozies, but depending a lot on forgiveness and grace to get through it. So I wake up every morning and say my prayers, and then throughout the day I keep, as my sister's fond of saying, I like to get all prayed up, and then keep filling up the tank throughout the day just to get through it. So yeah, so that's how I see it. I see it as a sense of call.
Thank you. So as you're observing and interacting with these issues as both clergy and also with your past government experience, I'm wondering what you would think of as a forward-thinking ethic of policing, and if there are particular models of policing that are being tried or talked about that seem especially promising to you, and why.
Right. So this is an area that I'm just beginning to look at. I will say that years ago in my life, I managed a national reentry program when I was with a group called Public-Private Ventures, and we ventured to places like Great Britain to look at how they do reentry, but also in doing that, we saw how they do policing. And in the smaller towns, I know it's changed a lot in London and maybe some of the other bigger cities, it's just a very different approach. It is not first and foremost about domination and control, social control, supporting racial order. It's more about being of service to the people in the community. And how to engage community organizations to make sure that those places have the kind of peace and tranquility and the ability to function and flourish like they wish. And I think there are other examples of this around the world, and there are communities around the country that are beginning to experiment with it. But I think we need to. It behooves us now to say, all right. And perhaps in response to the crack epidemic, to this declaration of the war on drugs that preceded that, we went way too far in enforcement, equipment, militarizing police, having police do things that they shouldn't be doing. I don't think the department should be training school safety officers. I think we should find another way to do that. So let's look at this thing now. Again, these folks have broken it open. We have a moment. So let's take advantage of this moment. Look at best practices around the world, not just here in the U.S., and then let's provide the pressure, apply the pressure to the public officials and others to look at doing policing in a different way. Let's have some examples. Let's figure out what works, and let's work really hard to make it happen. But it won't happen if, like many things in this country, this gives way to the next thing that takes over the headline news at 7 o'clock at night, and we're off to the races to something else. This feels different. It feels like we're at a moment, both in terms of policing and race relations generally in this country. And so I think we should take advantage of it to try some of these more innovative and less enforcement-related ways of policing.
Thank you. I think we've got some questions from people other than me. That's a good thing.
We do. We have several questions that have come up in the chat. The first, go ahead, Fred. Sorry.
Yeah, just saying other people should feel free to make comments as well who are part of the panelists here. But go ahead. I'm sorry, Megan.
I'm going to skip around a bit. So this first question is from Noah McLean, who used to work as an investigator for the CCRB. And he shared that many of the investigations were against individual police officers responsible, but the problem was more of a structural issue. So the question is, under the current constraints, are there ways for the CCRB's mission to, for example, cite the NYPD as a whole as a subject?
I think bringing complaints against the department as a whole, or investigating complaints against the department as a whole, is a little tricky. We're doing it on some things. For example, on body-worn camera footage right now, we're not charging individual officers for using body-worn camera footage improperly. We're actually charging, I think, the chief of patrol with that issue because we are saying that the department, since body-worn cameras are relatively new, has a responsibility to train the officers effectively in how to use the cameras. Now, after a period, the agency will start to charge individual officers. But there are ways to hold the department as a whole accountable for the activities of officers, particularly when they've been misinstructed or not sufficiently instructed in how to carry out their jobs. I'll say one other thing in that regard, and that is one of the things both that will happen as a result, I'm hoping, of both the Attorney General's investigation, the Department of Investigation here in New York City's investigation, and way on the back end of CCRB's adjudication of the cases that are before us as a result of the protests. All of these groups, AG, DOI, CCRB, are going to talk about patterns and practices in policing in New York City that need to change. The sun is playing havoc with my camera, so please forgive me. And forgive the sun, I guess. But we're going to focus on, we're going to have something to say about patterns and practices within the department and what needs to be changed. And then what rules or regs or laws need to be changed so that those patterns and practices change as well. The person who was the investigator that asked the question is absolutely right. It's the system, in addition to the individual officers, that we need to pay attention to. And again, I think what has happened in this moment has broken open an opportunity to address those more systemic issues within at least this New York City department, police department, and maybe others around the country.
So following up on that, or were you going to ask again, Megan? Do you have another? Okay. So following up on that, I'm wondering about the education level required. You know, there's a lot of talk about how in Europe, especially, sometimes 4-year degrees are required, certainly 2- and 3-year degrees versus our sort of several months. But then there's also a justice issue in limiting access to the ability to serve. And I'm wondering what your observations are on that.
Right. So I think that, the public needs to support these officers to learn not just criminal justice and maybe less of that, and more of the cultural arts and liberal arts where you actually learn about different cultures and come to appreciate different cultures and come to appreciate human behavior and what contributes to certain types of human behavior. And for people who want to be police officers who can't afford to get that level of education, there should be some support for it. Obviously, predicated on the officer's performance and seriousness with which they're taking the education, and then an obligation to stay with the force for a while if indeed the public, however that happens, does pay for that education. But I do think we need to think more seriously about the ways in which officers are educated, not just a few criminal justice related courses, but a full humanities program where there's a greater appreciation for difference and for human nature and what makes us tick as a whole.
Thank you. Another question is kind of a combination of several people's questions, but you spoke a bit about demilitarizing the police. What steps could be taken to start that process? And also in combination with that, when police are enforcing unjust laws, what steps could be taken in that regard as well?
So that's the first one. I think the Obama administration went a long way in demilitarizing police, if I said that right, by saying we're just going to simply stop selling excess military equipment to police departments. There's no need to do that. And that had become the practice. The federal government was making money by selling armaments of war to departments around the country. And the Obama administration said, we're going to stop that. And they stopped it. Of course, the Trump administration has reopened that practice. And right now, departments around the country are buying these weapons. I think as we look at the New York City Police Department's budget, we need to ask seriously if the New York City Police Department is buying these weapons. Do they need them? And if they're weapons that that would be used, in the field of war, as opposed to serving the people of the city of New York, then we have no business buying them. So that's a big way, I think, to get rid of the weapons that people feel like they have to use simply because they have to have them. And then you got to change the culture again. It's just got to be about something different than domination and control. Domination and control. There's no reason to use batons on people who are peacefully protesting. That was just stunning to me to see that here in New York City, that we were doing that. There's just no reason for that at all. And that's a culture change that needs to happen. You don't have to corral people and beat them. It's because they've simply broken a curfew and are peacefully protesting. You don't do that in a civilized society. And we shouldn't be doing it here in New York. So we need a culture change, a serious culture change about how we do policing here. So that would be a big way of demilitarizing police. In terms of police enforcing unjust laws, you have to change the laws. I mean, the police are required to enforce the law. If the law is bad, that's not the police fault. Police is, person's fault. That's the fault of the legislature that made the law. And so we just have to work on changing those laws.
So in thinking about how to demilitarize the police, and you were, I think, leaning into a little bit the idea of the struggle that police officers face with when they're supposed to treat people in what way, right? Are you the victim? Are you the perpetrator? I don't know who I'm looking at. how can we as people of and communities of faith help to advocate for destigmatizing and normalizing and increasing the mental health care for police officers?
Sure. That's a very good question. And I think that, you know, we all need to insist on the availability of mental health services in the least complicated way for police officers. The suicide rates, of course, are disturbing, very disturbing. There's something about the stress of the job and other components of it that clearly have a real profound impact on the people who do the job. I think sometimes that causes them to do extreme things. And then there's again, the culture, you know, a very macho culture that says you're not weak. And to acknowledge mental health issues, emotional health issues, the fact that you need to talk to somebody could be perceived as a sign of weakness. All that's got to change. And I think there is some breaking of the ice, you know, on that. But I think the department has to make the availability of mental health services, behavioral health services, they need to make that as accessible as possible with the least amount of complications for officers who feel like they need it. And if they need some anonymity in the midst of that, that should happen too. And maybe a culture, you know, not maybe, but create a culture where there's very little stigma attached to seeking the help you need, and in fact, where that's actually celebrated and encouraged.
Another question, or again, a combination of questions, is about defunding the police or reallocating the money that goes to the police to other, you know, like mental health or community outreach type programs. So one person asked, in your professional opinion, like, how possible do you think that is to reallocate some of that funding? And then do you know of examples of where that has been successful?
I can't cite you examples now, but I will tell you it will happen here in New York City. There will be a reallocation of some of the resources. I don't think it's going to be $1 billion, but I am confident that you will see a reallocation of resources from the NYPD to other types of services, youth services, social services, etc.
Fred, I'm wondering, you talked about officers increasingly being non-white, but leadership remaining predominantly white. And I'm wondering in what ways that's actually a mechanism to more thoroughly join officers on the street with the communities that they serve, and also mindful that there might be other complications with that. And I'm wondering how that's playing out.
So I think that, I'll answer it this way. I think there are people within the NYPD who can really help with this transition of the department looking more like the city of New York. There are some people who've been there a long time. For example, First Deputy Police Commissioner Ben Tucker. He's an African-American man. He's been in and out of the police department. He's done other jobs. He has a good, you know, sort of a good sense. He lives in Crown Heights, I believe, has lived there pretty much all his life, if not Crown Heights, close to there in Brooklyn. And so he walks in and out of these worlds. I believe there are other people like him in the department who can help affect this kind of transition to a department that really represents the city of New York. And I think it's incumbent upon the leadership in the department, as well as the leadership in the city, from the mayor to the city council and others, to help support those people who do come from both of these many, you know, both of these worlds or several worlds, to be a resource to the department as it makes this transition. And I think very often that resource is overlooked, and to the department's detriment, simply because a lot of these people don't look like the folks who are currently in the hierarchy of the department. But I think the department really needs to take advantage of the high-ranking people of color who are committed to a police department that's really going to serve the people of their communities. Again, moving away from this whole notion of domination and control, and then really see them as resources and not as threats, and changing the department and making it the kind of police department that I think we need in the 21st century.
Can you share about the diversity of complaints? You mentioned earlier that it's mostly, I believe you said people of color that are filing complaints against white police officers. So one person has asked specifically about Asian complaints from Asian, complaints from Asian people. Could you just share in general about diversity of the complaints? Does that make sense?
I don't have those statistics at my fingertips, but they are on the CCRB's website. You can do it by precinct, by borough, and there may even be an overlay maybe of community boards and things like that. But there's a lot of good data. Just prior to my coming on the board of the CCRB, they started something called I think it's Transparent Data Initiative, TDI, to make more and more data available to the public. And so you can go to the site and look up communities or precincts or just citywide, and I think find that kind of breakdown of data. The other thing I would tell you, since we're on the whole data issue and information issue, with the repeal of this 50A, the secrecy law as it's commonly called, the CCRB can now make considerable more data available to the public. So I hope that the executive director, Jonathan Darsh, and his team tell me and tell the board that within maybe 6 months to a year, there'll be a searchable database where you can go in and find out an officer's disciplinary history. At least it relates to the CCRB. I think the NYPD should do the same thing, since they have oversight for discipline that's not within the CCRB's jurisdiction. But at least within the CCRB, you'll be able to do a data search, use a database, do an online search, and know something about the officers and the people who are serving in your community.
Thank you. Someone is sharing their screen. So in how long does a review process take? Can you kind of walk us through it?
Yeah, so it depends. I would say probably, I wish I had those stats right at my hand, so don't hold me too much to this, although I know this is being recorded, but I think you should think about a year from the time you file until the time a case is resolved. So, and it depends on the severity of the case, depends on how much information is needed. So you can file a complaint either online, nyc.gov/CCRB complaint. You can dial 311 and file a complaint, or you can call the CCRB office. I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I can get it for you. And before COVID, you could actually go to 100 Church Street, file a complaint, and then there were city council people in the various council-managed council districts who would open their offices so people could come in and file complaints. But the best way, I think, is to file online. You can upload video footage if you file online that you have. I will say that, so you file a complaint, and then an investigator reaches out, asks some more questions, and they might set up for a more formal interview. Again, in the old days, pre-COVID, often they came out to areas and would meet people at community-based organizations or council offices and places like that. They're now doing interviews by both I'm pretty sure telephone and video conferencing where that's possible. There's also then data gathering, evidence gathering. So we can subpoena, for example, camera footage. Now that every officer's wearing a body-worn camera, there's access to that footage. And that's been a little tough. And we're really pushing the department to make accessibility easier. And I think I know we've got an MOU that we're beginning to implement so that the agency can get body-worn camera footage more quickly. So we gather, the investigators gather the evidence. And then there's the interviewing of the police officer and scheduling that. Usually every police officer comes for an interview with a lawyer provided by the union. And that happens. And so once all the interviewing is done, all the evidence is gathered, then the investigators write up a report. They talk about what allegations have been made within those categories I mentioned to you, what the evidence says about those allegations, and then a recommended disposition of those allegations. The members of the board, those 15 members, then get those reports. We do them in panels of 3. We review them. And then we make a decision about what to do with the allegations. Are we substantiating them? Are we finding the officer guilty? If so, what's the penalty? Are we saying by preponderance of the evidence, we can't tell whether the officer did it or not, so we're unsubstantiating? Are we saying a preponderance of the evidence says that it didn't happen, so we're saying it's unfounded? Or we're saying it did happen, but it wasn't illegal or improper activity, so we're exonerating. And then that's communicated to the department. The department then, eventually, there's an office at the police department, One Police Plaza, that reviews all of our recommendations, and then they go up to the commissioner, and then the commissioner makes the ultimate decision. There was one other thing I wanted to say about that process that it just went out of my mind, but that's how it happens. And now the public can know, because in the past, all we could do was talk to the complainant about what the outcome was without any details. Now, not only does the complainant know what happened, but the entire public can know what happened. Here's the point I wanted to make. Video footage has made a huge difference in the ability of the CCRB to do its job. Substantiations are up significantly because we now have video footage, either footage that people have taken with their phones and uploaded to the CCRB, so we have access to it, the investigators have access to it, or the body-worn camera footage that we get from the officers. But the more these interactions between officers and the public are actually recorded and shared, I think the more accountability and transparency there is there, and the greater the confidence and trust there'll be for the public that the officers are being held accountable for how they do their jobs.
Thank you. So, knowing the history of how we get police and the way it's tied up in race from its very inception point, and knowing the regularity of race-based policing, what do you see as appropriate, effective consequences for officers, for the department, and for department leadership when there's clearly race-based policing that is happening or has happened?
Well, I think first the leadership has to admit that it's happened, and then I think we need the appropriate resources to deal with it. So I don't know if I should be talking about this in public or not, but I am. The CCRB is going to take seriously racial profiling. I'll put it that way. We're going to take it more seriously. And you'll see that in the coming months. But the resources have to be there to deal with it. It's a very, very difficult thing to prove, or so I'm told by the experts. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't wrestle with it. And it doesn't mean that the department shouldn't wrestle with it, or City Hall, or the City Council, or the state legislature. We need to take seriously this, that profiling happens. And the people who are poor are more vulnerable, fewer resources. When it happens to me, and it does happen to me, I have more things to lean on during those encounters. I spend weekends out in Greene County, where I am actually now. I'm driving down a country road by myself in my little Mini Cooper, and a county sheriff jumps in behind me. And I shared this with with one of the commissioners designees on the board. County sheriff gets behind me. I'm doing the speed limit. I'm not thinking anything. And then suddenly, he slows way down. I said, all right, so he sees something. And then hits the gas and comes flying up behind me, like, throws on brakes. I just keep driving. And then he does it again. And then I get to a stop sign and he pulls way over, so in the left side, so that I can see that he's there. And, all I had to do, if officer, what is going, and it could have been anything. I just drove off. I figured if the guy's gonna pull me over, let him pull me over and we'll deal with it there. But I also know that I've got a bunch of stuff behind me if I have an encounter with an officer. Most people don't. And so we need to take seriously the fact that this kind of stuff happens, not pretend it doesn't. And then put mechanisms in place so that it happens less frequently, because officers are trained not to profile folks. And then two, we need to investigate racial profiling more seriously. And I think you'll see the CCRB taking it more seriously in the months to come.
Thank you. The next question is from Herman Darden. The question is, Councilwoman Inez Barron is proposing legislation to strengthen the CCRB. If you're familiar with her concern, what is the difference between the current board and what a stronger board could be?
Right. So and I have a lot of sympathy and respect for the folks who are proposing an elected civilian complaint review board. The things that they are proposing, proposing, most of them I agree with. Binding disciplinary procedures being one of the biggest ones. And then there's a set of other things. The one thing that they are proposing that I don't agree with, that they're proposing that I don't agree with, is this notion of electing a CCRB. And here's why I don't agree with it. It will be too easy for people who are opposed to civilian oversight to run their own candidates and seriously fund them, like the unions, and have a CCRB that is beholden to police unions because they have the money to run people for office. So if there was some way to guarantee that these races could be only publicly financed, and there was some way to guarantee that the kind of help that people running for office came from community folks and not, these institutions who have no real interest in civilian oversight, then I could maybe get my way there. But I just think there's too much opportunity for mischief in trying to elect a civilian oversight board, as opposed to having it appointed and the elected officials that do the appointing being accountable to the people. Most of the other things that these public officials and community folks are proposing related to a more strengthened and stronger CCRB, I completely support. And binding disciplinary decisions is one of the biggest ones.
So I know your area of expertise is the city, but I'm wondering what you do know about similar programs or organizations to CCRB beyond the city, and to what extent do you think that the CCRB can or should be a model beyond the city?
Right. So there are a couple of places, and I'm going to get them. I'm not going to get them all right, but I'm pretty sure that San Francisco and a couple of other places around the country have binding disciplinary decisions, and I think that's the biggest thing. I think when a civilian oversight board makes a recommendation for discipline, and the department has the authority simply to jettison that, it undermines confidence in the whole process. Again, we've been pushing for the department to get closer in concurrence. I think the other thing is the substantiation rates have to increase. So when people see that, you know, over the course of a year, there's a substantiation rate of 18 to 20%, that does not inspire confidence necessarily. So let's talk about how we get that rate up. And I mentioned a couple of ways tonight. One, support the people who make the complaints so that they stay with the process. And two, we have more video footage, and when video footage is used, the substantiation rate goes up to, I think, about 30 or 40%, as opposed to 18 to 20%. So there are some things that we can do there to increase confidence. But we can look around the country for other best practices that are working to make civilian oversight stronger. New York, by far, has the most authority, binding disciplinary decisions notwithstanding. We have subpoena authority. We can compel people to testify. We can gather evidence. We can try officers in a departmental trial. All those things are good civilian oversight mechanisms. We simply need more money for more capacity, and we need to do a lot more on community outreach so that people know the agency exists and have an opportunity to lodge their complaints about interactions with police officers that have gone awry. We do those things, we'll have a really strengthened and strong civilian oversight, as it should be. There should be civilian oversight of police discipline. We've been doing it for 27 years now in New York. We're the strongest we've ever been. Now is not the time to stop, but let's continue to work to increase the strength of this agency and oversight.
So I think this may be our last, we're wrapping it up. One of our last questions is, what key steps would you suggest for changing the culture, the police culture, from one of dominion to service?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, we've talked a lot about a lot of things. But I think elected officials and others, people who influence public policy and how we see ourselves in the world can help a great deal with just being committed to having a different type of policing, and hire leaders of departments who are also committed to that. And again, moving away from domination and control to actually really being about community service and partnerships and collaborations. There are green shoots of that around the city and around the country. We need to pay attention to them, nourish them, cultivate them, understand what's working and what's not and why, and replicate them, and particularly replicate them here in New York, so we can be really proud of the department that we have here, and stand out as a model for the rest of the country, if not the rest of the world.
Fred, I could just keep you here all night, but that would be rude, and we would maybe lose everyone else.
You, I think.
Thank you so much. And I'm wondering if you have any any final thoughts or observations that what haven't we asked?
The only thing I would say is this is exactly what should be happening. Holding these kinds of forums. I would encourage you to do it with elected officials as well, particularly now state officials who passed this really sweeping and I think effective legislation. But continue these engagements, continue this dialogue. Hold all of the people who are in these public positions accountable. Don't let any of them or us get away with not following through on this, particularly this issue, because it has bedeviled the nation for a long time, and it's really, it's huge and problematic now, and now is the time to kind of make the changes we want. So I would say keep these kinds of conversations going. Find other people who have the ability to make change, and bring them in to talk to you, and let them know of the values that drive this group and the kind of, as King might say, the beloved community we want to see and that we have in various ways given our lives to work toward. Let them know that, and let them know that you want to be a partner with them in trying to make those changes.
Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Fred Davies. Let's give a silent round of applause. And with that, I will return the mic to Ed Horn to close us out for the evening.
Fred, we want to thank you so much, especially that last call to action. This is a great conversation, and you've given us so much food for thought and food for future action. We certainly want to keep the conversation going as part of MFSA and our partners and neighbors and friends. So let's keep that going. I know I live in a small town now in upstate Connecticut, and I'm thinking about ways to get some civilian oversight up here. And I'm really glad that we have the resource available of the website that we can refer to as well. So thank you so much. And I'm also say that as one fellow alum of Yale Divinity School to another. And another. And friends, thank you all for joining us. Want to mention again that we are a membership organization, certainly in the invitation that went out from Marisa Villarreal, our treasurer. You saw the membership opportunities there. So if you'd like to join up, there is a membership donation requested, and that helps us to do programs like this. So we want to do more and more kinds of things and keep us connected, and we'll do these sorts of things to online, and when we have an opportunity to do them in person, we'll do them as well. So thanks to all our leadership team, and Craig, Megan Hale, Jennifer Berry, George McLean, Marisa Villarreal, Carolyn Engelhardt, and probably forgot somebody, so forgive me if I did, but we've been working hard as a leadership team to help make it happen. And by the way, I know this is around the time when we would, of course, had annual conference, and that the bishop, of course, wisely delayed. We would have had our annual membership dinner, which is the time when we would have gotten most of our membership renewals. So in honor of that, if you would do it, that'd be great. Well, maybe we'll have a virtual dinner of some type and a membership event and honoring that we do with our Justice Awards and the like. But for now, thanks so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your evening, and we will be in touch about future programming. Please direct any questions to any of us about that. So, and Jen, would you please close us in prayer?
I'd be happy to. Holy and loving God, in this time when we are working so hard not to breathe on one another, help us to remember to breathe with one another. Remind us that through the Holy Spirit, we can conspire to make this world ready to be the kingdom as you have so described it to us. Help us, God, to not get lost in the quagmire of worry and details that would be so easy to find ourselves stuck in. Help us instead, God, to rise above and be the casters of visions and the dreamers of dreams that you need, the prophets for this time, and to speak boldly, knowing that when we speak prophecy, it is you, and we are but vessels. Guide us safely into our rest this night, and allow us to rise refreshed and ready for a new day of challenges tomorrow. All this and so much more we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, big thank
Well,
you. Okay,
See
good
you
night,
again.
everybody.
Bye-bye.